Judge Richard Calloway barely glanced up as he flipped through the case file, his fingers drumming idly against the polished wood of the bench. To him, this was just another morning in Fulton County Superior Court, another defendant, another inevitable conviction. He had presided over hundreds of cases like this, young men in baggy clothes, accused of crimes they'd never afford the lawyers to beat. At the defendant's table stood Marcus Evans, 20 years old, hands tucked in the pockets of his hoodie. The courtroom lights cast a shadow over his face, but his posture was relaxed, too relaxed for a kid about to go away for grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Judge Calloway sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Let's make this quick, people. I've got a golf game at 2. A soft chuckle rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff smirked. The stenographer hid a grin. Even prosecutor Philip Harrington allowed himself a small, knowing smile as he straightened his tie. It was the laugh of people who had already decided how this would end. Marcus didn't laugh. Harrington rose from his seat, his voice crisp. Rehearsed a man who had done this 100 times. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Marcus Evans, was caught behind the wheel of a stolen BMW X5, pursued by officers, and apprehended after attempting to flee. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence is clear." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. "Seemed open and shut. A stolen car. A chase. What kind of innocent man runs?" Judge Calloway leaned back, peering at Marcus over his glasses. "You hearing all this, son?" Marcus lifted his chin just slightly enough to show he wasn't afraid. "I hear it just fine, Your Honor." Something in his voice made Harrington hesitate, just for a second. But no one in that courtroom had realized it yet. They had already made their first mistake. Prosecutor Philip Harrington exhaled sharply, stepping toward the jury box with the measured confidence of a man who had already won. His navy blue suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and every movement carried the assurance of experience of someone who had sent dozens of young men just like Marcus Evans to prison. He clasped his hands in front of him, letting the silence settle before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth, polished, practiced. "This is not a complicated case. The state will present clear, undeniable evidence that Marcus Evans is guilty of grand theft auto and resisting arrest." He turned slightly, motioning toward Marcus with just enough subtlety to remind the jury who the villain was supposed to be. On the night of July 14th, at approximately 10:42 p.m., a BMW X5 was reported stolen from a gas station in downtown Atlanta. The owner, Mr. William Draper, had left the car running while he stepped inside to pay for gas. Moments later, the vehicle was gone. Harrington paced slowly, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished courtroom floor. At 11:17 p.m., police spotted the stolen vehicle speeding through a residential neighborhood. When officers activated their lights, the driver, this defendant, refused to stop. Instead, he led police on a reckless pursuit through city streets, endangering innocent lives. He let that last phrase hang in the air. Endangering innocent lives. The jury shifted. A few leaned forward. Harrington continued. When the vehicle was finally abandoned near a vacant lot, officers pursued the suspect Marcus Evans on foot. He ran. He resisted. And when he was caught, his fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He paused, letting it sink in. "Now, the defense might try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding. That perhaps Mr. Evans just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." He turned now, directly facing the jury, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable, almost sympathetic. "But let's use common sense. What kind of innocent person runs from the police?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Calloway rested his chin on his hand, watching the young man at the defendant's table. Marcus still hadn't flinched. His hands remained in his pockets, his expression calm, unreadable. But Harrington wasn't finished. He strode toward the prosecution's table, picking up a neatly stacked folder of documents. "Your Honor, the state will also submit into evidence the testimony of Officer Daniel Brooks, an experienced law enforcement officer who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle before he attempted to flee." He held up a printed report, tapping it lightly against his palm for emphasis. "Officer Brooks will testify that he saw Marcus Evans, with his own eyes, driving that car before the chase began." Harrington turned back to the jury, offering them a confident smile. The evidence speaks for itself. The testimony, the chase, the fingerprints. The state will prove, beyond any doubt, that the defendant stole this vehicle, attempted to evade law enforcement, and resisted arrest when finally caught. That is the truth. He let the words settle. Judge Calloway sighed, rubbing his temple, already thinking about his golf game. Sounds straightforward to me. And for most of the people in that courtroom, it did. The case seemed airtight. The defendant? Guilty as charged. But at the defense table, Marcus Evans said nothing. He just waited, because he saw something that no one else did. The cracks. And when he spoke, those cracks would break this case wide open. Silence filled the courtroom. The weight of Prosecutor Harrington's case lingered in the air like a fog, thick and suffocating. The jury sat still, their expressions unreadable. But the message was clear: this was supposed to be the end of the road for Marcus Evans. At the defense table, Public Defender Carla Simmons shuffled her papers, preparing to respond. But before she could rise, a hand touched her arm. Marcus. She looked at him, confused. He didn't say a word, just gave a small, silent nod. Judge Richard Calloway, who had already half-turned toward his gavel, expecting a standard, weak defense, raised an eyebrow at the hesitation. Miss Simmons, are we going to hear from the defense or not? Marcus stood up. You will, Your Honor. His voice was steady, clear, not the shaky, uncertain tone of a desperate man. Calloway blinked. I'll be defending myself. The courtroom froze. For a long beat, no one said a word. The gallery shifted. A few gasps, a couple of whispers. Harrington's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. This should be interesting. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temple like a man who'd seen too much nonsense in his career. You sure about this, son? You've been charged with grand theft auto. Resisting arrest. You really think you can out-argue a seasoned prosecutor? Marcus didn't flinch. He pulled his hands from his pockets and adjusted his stance, meeting the judge's gaze head-on. I don't think, Your Honor. I know. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. Even the bailiff, who had spent most of the trial suppressing yawns, leaned forward slightly. Calloway tapped his fingers against his desk, considering, then finally let out a long breath. Fine. Let's hear it. Marcus turned, his eyes landing squarely on Harrington. Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Harrington crossed his arms. Go ahead. Marcus took a slow step forward. Not rushed, not nervous, just precise. You said Officer Daniel Brooks personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen BMW before I was arrested. That's correct. Harrington exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his official report? Of course it is. Harrington gave a tight smile, glancing at the jury like he was explaining something to a slow student. That's how police work, Mr. Evans. Marcus nodded. Then, with the same measured calm, he turned to Judge Calloway. Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Brooks' testimony as evidence. The room stiffened. Calloway's brow furrowed. On what grounds? Marcus pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time since the trial started, and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Brooks never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A ripple of confusion passed through the courtroom. Harrington's smirk disappeared. What are you talking about? Marcus took another step forward, his voice calm, unwavering. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Brooks' GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me driving the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But he let the words hang. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Calloway glanced at Harrington, his expression less amused now. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Marcus gave a small, almost casual shrug. If Officer Brooks was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. He let that sit. But if he wasn't? Silence. Judge Calloway studied Marcus for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned to Harrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly the judge noticed. Marcus took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, learning how they played the system. And if Harrington was truly confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Calloway sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Harrington's fingers tightened around his pen. Then, reluctantly, "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The energy in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable. No one was laughing anymore. Judge Richard Calloway tapped his gavel lightly, breaking the tension. "Very well. The court will obtain Officer Brooks' GPS records. In the meantime, let's continue." He turned to Marcus Evans. "You're up, Mr. Evans. If you're going to tear apart the prosecution's case, now's your chance." Marcus nodded, stepping toward the center of the courtroom. He was in no hurry. He moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent years preparing for a moment just like this. He turned, locking eyes with the jury. He didn't start with fire and theatrics. He started with logic. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the prosecution's claims. They say I was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, that I ran because I was guilty, that my fingerprints on the steering wheel prove I committed a crime." He took a measured pause, letting the words settle. "Sounds simple, right?" A few jurors shifted in their seats. "But let's take a step back. Let's actually think about what they're saying." He turned slightly, glancing at Harrington, who was already gripping his pen a little tighter. "Prosecutor Harrington is asking you to believe that fingerprints alone equal guilt." He held up his hands. "So let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a department store and tried on a jacket? Maybe put your hands in the pockets, zipped it up, and put it back on the rack?" A couple of jurors nodded faintly. Marcus tilted his head. "Now imagine that hours later, someone else steals that same jacket. Your fingerprints are still on it. Does that mean you stole it?" Silence. The jurors looked at each other. Harrington cleared his throat. "That's not the same thing." Marcus cut him off smoothly. "Isn't it?" Harrington clamped his mouth shut. Marcus turned back to the jury. "The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before it was stolen. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yeah, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked." His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. I just touched the door." He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the room like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" The tension was thick. A few murmurs from the gallery. A couple of jurors exchanged glances. Harrington flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything to regain control. Marcus wasn't done yet. He turned to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, let's talk about that fingerprint evidence for a second." Calloway gestured for him to continue. "Prosecutor Harrington, can you confirm for the court was the forensic specialist responsible for analyzing my fingerprints subpoenaed to testify today?" Calloway blinked. It was a simple question. But the prosecution wasn't expecting it. Harrington hesitated. A fraction of a second. Too long. Then, reluctantly, "No." A low ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Marcus gave a small nod, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." He turned back to the jury. "So let me get this straight. Fingerprint evidence is the backbone of the prosecution's case against me. And yet, they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual forensic specialist who processed that evidence?" He shook his head. "No chance for me to cross-examine. No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody. No way to challenge the accuracy of the analysis." His eyes met Harrington's. Direct. Unflinching. "Why is that?" Harrington's jaw tightened. Judge Calloway rubbed his temple, exhaling slowly. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not as simple as he had assumed. Marcus stepped back, hands in his pockets again, letting the silence linger. The prosecution's case, the airtight, open and shut case, had just started to crack. The cracks in the prosecution's case had started to show. Now, Marcus was about to shatter it completely. Judge Richard Calloway sighed, rubbing his forehead. What had started as a routine case, a young man accused of car theft, An easy conviction had turned into something far more complicated. He could feel it. Everyone in the room could. Even prosecutor Philip Harrington, once so smug and confident, was stiff in his seat, his fingers tightening around his pen. Marcus, however, looked completely at ease. He walked toward the evidence table, pausing just long enough to let the tension settle. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear, steady. "I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the registered owner of the stolen vehicle, Mr. William Draper." Judge Calloway frowned, glancing at Harrington. "The owner?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The man who actually reported his car stolen." He pulled a printed transcript from a file and held it up. "For some reason, this wasn't submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why." The room stilled. Calloway exhaled sharply. "Co." Marcus turned, his gaze locking onto Harrington. "Mr. Draper gave a full statement to police the night his car was reported stolen. And in that statement, he described the suspect he saw running off with his vehicle." Marcus flipped the page, scanning it for a moment before reading aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The jury shifted. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Marcus held the paper up higher. "That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." Judge Calloway leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Harrington," he said slowly. "Is this true?" The prosecutor's jaw clenched. "Your Honor, that statement is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." Marcus cut him off. "No, I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a blade. Harrington froze. Marcus took a slow step forward. "I wasn't in the car when police found it. I wasn't anywhere near the car. I was walking home from getting snacks with my friends. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." Silence. Then he turned, facing the jury directly. "The real suspect got away that night. But instead of finding him, the officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough." The room was so still that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, studying the young man before him. This trial had changed. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about the system itself. And for the first time in his long career, Calloway wasn't sure which side he was on. A suffocating silence filled the courtroom. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of Marcus's words still hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room like an undeniable truth. Judge Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This case was supposed to be simple. A young man caught near a stolen vehicle, an easy conviction, a quick ruling before his 2 p.m. golf game. Now, it was a mess. The jury wasn't nodding along anymore. They were thinking, their expressions no longer passive but concerned. In the gallery, the soft murmur of voices grew louder. People weren't just watching a trial. They were watching it unravel. At the prosecution's table, Philip Harrington sat frozen, gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His entire case had been built on certainties: a clear suspect, clear evidence, a straight line to conviction. But that straight line had just bent into a knot. Marcus stood still, calm, patient, as if he already knew what was coming next. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temple. He turned to Harrington. "Mr. Harrington," his voice was measured, but there was something new in his tone. "Doubt. Do you have any response to this?" Harrington cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he started, but the usual sharpness in his voice was gone. He stopped himself, swallowed, adjusted his tie. "We still have the defendant's fingerprints on the steering wheel. That alone is compelling evidence." Marcus raised a single finger. "Not so fast." Calloway's eyes flicked toward him. "You have something else to add, Mr. Evans?" Marcus gave a small nod. "Your Honor, at this point, we've already proven that the prosecution has ignored critical evidence, withheld key witness testimony, and built their case on assumptions rather than facts." He let the statement sit for a moment. "But let's talk about the one thing they're still clinging to: those fingerprints." He turned toward the jury, his voice steady, unwavering. "We already established that I touched the car hours before it was stolen. We already established that I was nowhere near it when it was abandoned. And yet, the prosecution still expects you to believe that fingerprints alone are enough for a conviction. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Let's put this in real-world terms. If someone steals a shopping cart from the grocery store, and your fingerprints are on the handle, does that mean you stole it? A couple of jurors shifted uncomfortably. Marcus took another step closer to them, his voice softer now, almost conversational. Or let's say you walk into a bank, use an ATM, and hours later someone robs the place. Your fingerprints are on the machine. Does that make you the thief? Now the jury wasn't just shifting, they were nodding. Harrington's face paled. Marcus turned back toward Calloway, his hands once again tucked casually into his pockets. Your Honor, at this point, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges. The prosecution's case is built on nothing but weak evidence, misleading testimony, and bias-driven assumptions. Judge Calloway didn't respond right away. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control of his own courtroom. He had spent decades handing out sentences, believing in the efficiency of the system. But right now, in this moment, he could feel the truth staring him in the face. They had almost convicted an innocent man. Calloway adjusted his glasses. His fingers tightened around his gavel. Then, finally, he leaned forward. His voice, when it came, was quieter, more deliberate. Case dismissed. The words rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. A stunned silence, then chaos. Half the room erupted in whispers, the gallery buzzing, reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. Some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. At the prosecution's table, Harrington sat stiff, his jaw clenched, his case and his reputation crumbling before him. But at the defense table, Marcus didn't move. He just let the moment settle, let the reality sink in for everyone else. Calloway still gripped his gavel, his gaze locked on Marcus. And for the first time in this entire trial, there was something in the judge's eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. For a long moment after Judge Richard Calloway's gavel struck the bench, the courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Case dismissed. Two simple words, yet they carried the weight of something much greater. At the prosecution's table, Philip Harrington sat rigid, his face pale, his carefully crafted case reduced to nothing more than scraps of paper and misplaced confidence. He had walked into this trial expecting an easy victory, another statistic. Another young man pushed through the system. Instead, he had been outmaneuvered. At the defense table, Marcus Evans didn't move right away. He just stood there, hands still casually tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. He had known this would happen. He had known from the moment Harrington hesitated. From the moment the jury started questioning. From the moment the cracks had turned into fractures, and the fractures had shattered the entire case. Slowly, Marcus let out a quiet breath. It was over. In the gallery, the reaction was mixed, some whispered in disbelief, others in quiet relief. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, knowing that this trial wasn't just about Marcus Evans anymore. It was about something bigger. Marcus turned. His mother, Lena Evans, stood in the back row, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But the second their eyes met, something softened in her face. A mother's relief. A mother's pride. She shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Marcus chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She didn't respond right away. Then, after a pause, she stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. The cameras kept flashing, but Marcus wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Outside the courthouse, by the time Marcus stepped outside, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Marcus, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Marcus ignored them, pulling his hoodie over his head as he moved past the cameras. He didn't do this for the spectacle. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because it had to be done. But as he reached the curb, something made him stop. Across the street, standing beside his car, was Judge Calloway. For the first time that day, the old man didn't look amused. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't bored. He was thinking. For years, Calloway had treated cases like this as routine, another defendant, another conviction, another mark in the system. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Marcus studied him for a beat, then turned to leave. But before he could step away, Calloway called out. Evans. Marcus stopped, didn't turn, a pause. Then Calloway sighed, shaking his head. You should consider law school. For the first time, a small smirk played at the corner of Marcus's lips. He didn't need to consider it. He already knew. The cameras kept flashing. The reporters kept shouting. But Marcus Evans wasn't listening. He had walked into that courtroom as a defendant. He walked out as something else entirely. The legal system had tried to box him in, to make him another statistic, another young black man shuffled through the system on a fast track to a prison cell. They expected him to sit there, to nod along, to plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit because that's how it always worked. Except this time, it didn't. This time, the system blinked first. The question was how many times had it gotten away with not blinking at all? Marcus stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps, looking back at the building behind him. How many people had sat at that same defendant's table, with no way to fight back? No legal knowledge, no confidence. No one to tell them that the evidence against them was flawed, incomplete, or flat out fabricated. How many had been sentenced before their case even truly began? How many innocent people were in prison right now, because they didn't have the chance to do what he just did? Marcus knew the answer. Too many. This trial wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. It was about the ones who had been railroaded. The ones who had taken plea deals because they didn't know their rights. The ones who had been convicted because no one bothered to check the evidence. It was about the system. And the system was broken. Marcus turned his head slightly, glancing across the street. Judge Richard Calloway was still watching him. Standing beside his car, arms crossed. There was something in his expression now. Something that hadn't been there before. He had walked into that courtroom today assuming Marcus was just another kid in trouble. Just another name in the endless stream of cases he had seen come and go. But now, Calloway knew better. Because Marcus had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once it flinched. Marcus took a slow breath, exhaling as he turned away. This wasn't the last courtroom he'd stand in. But the next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. The lesson: how many other cases had gone this way. How many innocent people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Marcus had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one trial. This was about all of them. And the only way things change is if we make them change. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Because the justice system is built on laws. But it's run by people. And people can change. But only if we make them. So let's start now. The story of Marcus Evans isn't just about one young man proving his innocence. It's about something much bigger: the reality that the justice system doesn't always seek justice. For too long, people have been wrongly convicted, pressured into plea deals, or dismissed as guilty before they even have a chance to defend themselves. Why? Because the system favors efficiency over truth. It counts convictions like tallies on a scoreboard, forgetting that behind every case file is a human life. Marcus won his case not because the system worked for him, but because he knew how to fight back. But what about the ones who don't? What about those who never learned their rights, who can't afford a good attorney, who don't have the confidence to speak up? This story reminds us of something important. Justice is only as strong as those who demand it. As a society, we can't just assume the system will fix itself. It won't. We have to hold it accountable. We have to question, challenge, and demand fairness not just for ourselves, but for those who can't do it alone. Because if we stay silent, nothing changes. And if nothing changes, who's the next innocent person to be sent away? The story of Marcus Evans is more than just a courtroom drama. It's a wake-up call. It reminds us that justice isn't automatic. It's something we must fight for. If this story made you think, even for a moment, leave a like, subscribe, and join us as we share more powerful stories of truth, resilience, and justice.